You ever had something happen to you, not once, not twice, not even 3 or 4 times, but something happened to you over and over again? And maybe you tried to stop it or change it, and maybe that included even changing somebody else or even changing yourself. But no matter what you did, it kept happening over and over and over again. You kept finding yourself in that same situation, and even though you didn't like it, and even though you wanted to change it, you finally got to the point where you said, at least to yourself, I doubt this will ever change. I'm just going to have to get used to it. I'm just going to have to live with it. I doubt it'll change. It'll never get better. Maybe it'll get worse, but I doubt there's anything that I can do about it. Have you ever had a situation like that? Well, I'll tell you my story, but brace yourselves. This is difficult and sensitive. When my wife Rebecca and I go anywhere in a car and I'm driving, which is most any time Rebecca and I go anywhere in a car, she always comments. No, that's the nice word. She criticizes my driving. Not once, not twice, not 3 or 100 times. Every time. Every time. She's what we call a backseat driver. Do you know any? If you don't know any, you might be one. Okay. She says it's genetic, that she got it from her mother. And I believe her. Because I was actually driving once with both of them in the back seat. Her dad, John, my father-in-law, was sitting in the front seat, and they were both in the back seat. We were on a journey from Bowling Green to Nashville, Tennessee, and they were both telling me how to drive from Bowling Green to Nashville, Tennessee. We wound up in Detroit, Michigan. And I was glad. At one point, I was so exasperated, I said to Rebecca, who's driving this car, your mother or you? Make up your mind. Both of them were. Now, I tried different strategies to stop it. Distraction, video games, texting. Her, not me. I wasn't playing the game, right? Her. I would sing to her to get her to sleep, turning up the heat so she'd fall asleep, leaving her on the side of the road destitute. I tried everything I could think of, including the radical extreme step of trying to become a better and more attentive driver. That didn't even work. But I got my revenge. She went to Kentucky this weekend to visit her mother and to visit our son at college there. And so I'm not afraid to talk about her because she's not here this week. So she went to Kentucky. I put her at the Shell station up here on Randall Road. I put her on the Greyhound bus for 12 hours. 12 hours. I called it the midnight bus to Kentucky. Downgraded from the midnight train to Georgia, which is a nice accommodations if you know that song. So 12 hours on the bus, 12 hours of riding where she could not comment on this poor driver's driving. I just hope he didn't have a sign, 1-800, how's my driving? Or text me about my driving. She'd blow up the internet if she could text him about her driving. But here's the thing, when she gets back, I don't think she's going to learn anything from that. I don't think it's going to be any different. I don't think there's anything I can do about it. This has been happening for the entire, now coming up on 24 years that we've been married. I don't think it's going to change. And we laugh about that one. Rebecca laughs about it. She says when she's not scared silent by my driving, we laugh about that together. But I suspect that you have some more serious ones that we wouldn't laugh about. I know I do. Maybe it's some mistake that you make over and over again, and you've reached the point where you doubt it's going to change. Perhaps it's a sin that you commit over and over again, and you're not even sure why, or certainly not sure how to stop it, and you go, I've almost kind of reached a point, I wouldn't say it out loud, but in my heart I've reached a point where I go, I doubt it's going to change. The gospel of sin management, they call it. Maybe it's something that you say or do in your marriage over and over again. Perhaps it's a certain awkward tension in your relationships, whether it's in your marriage or with your parents or your children or at work or even in your relationship with God. And you realize that you're saying and doing the same things over and over again with the same attitude every time, and you're getting the same results, and it's not the results that you want. The quote was attributed to Einstein. It goes like this: insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But you find yourself doing the same things over and over again, getting the same results over and over again. And you've worked on it, and you've wished on it, and you've hoped on it, and you've probably even planned and strategized on it about how it would change. But finally, you reached the point where you said, look, at least within my heart, I doubt it'll ever change. I doubt it'll change. I'm going to have to live with it. And sometimes people live with it, and other times people walk away from those situations. Well, this week in Judges chapter 6, if you got your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Judges chapter 6. This week in Judges, the people of Israel, they've learned to live with it. They've learned to live with it. How many of you, by the way, are you reading in Judges reading plan, Bible reading plan? Are some of you doing that? If you're doing that, if you want to know where we are, we've still got those flyers. It has the whole list. It's on the kiosk, the Judges kiosk out in the lobby. And it's good reading, isn't it? I mean, it's not boring. It's not boring. Some of the Bible's boring. This is not boring. These stories, ancient stories, maybe they seem a little bit uncivilized, and we've talked, they seem violent by our standards. But you know what? We still live in a culture that's guided by the same standards that guided their culture. It comes out in a little different way. Maybe we're a little more civilized, but same thing. Judges 21:25. Those days there was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. We still live in a culture that still operates on those same principles. So sometimes Judges feels eerily similar to things in our culture, and certainly to some things that are still going on in the world. And for Israel in the book of Judges, they were doubting that anything was going to change. The book of Judges covers this 330-year period, and we've talked about this from Joshua, the leader of Israel, of Moses and Joshua fame, when Joshua died, all the way to the time that Israel got their first king, King Saul, in about the year 1048, 1050 BC. So it covers this 330-year period and all that's going on in that period. And during that period, there was a particular cycle that developed that just kept going round and round and round. The people of Israel would disobey God, and they'd turn away from Him, and disaster would come, and they'd figure out that disaster was discipline from the Lord, and so they'd repent, or at least say they were sorry, and then God would deliver them. And this went on and on and on. They get liberated, there's peace and prosperity for a while, and then they forget about God, and they want to be more like the people around them, and they begin turning to the ways and the worship of the people around them, and this cycle keeps going over and over again. And they had reached a point by the time of this judge that we're going to read about today, where they doubted that it would ever change. They doubted that it would ever change. Maybe it couldn't ever change. And even the judge that God raises up to lead them at this point doubts that it will change, and he certainly doubts that he could do anything about it. Judges chapter 6, beginning with verse 1. The Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. The Midianites were a nomadic people in that area of Canaan, and there's not one specific king given. The Midianites, as far as we could tell, didn't have one specific king. They had a little more decentralized type of government. They were more like raiders, groups of nomadic raiders, or maybe we'd call them terrorists in some way. And verse 2, because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountain clefts and caves and strongholds. They were running to hide. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and other eastern peoples invaded the country. So people would come in, and they camped on the land, and they ruined the crops, and they didn't spare anything. And they came up with their livestock in their tents like swarms of locusts. Impossible to count them. So they would just descend all over the land of Israel, and they would invade the land and ravage it. They devoured everything. Like an old Baptist at a buffet, nothing was left when they got done. And not just once or twice, or not just 1 year or 2 years, but every year when Israel planted their crops. This kept happening over and over again. Verse 6, Midian so impoverished the Israelites, and you can imagine how that happened, that they cried out to the Lord for help. When they cried to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians. I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you the land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the God of the Amorites, another one of the people living in that land, in whose land that you live. But you have not listened to me. So they cry for help from the Midianite raiders, and God sends them a prophet. And they must have thought at first, God, we didn't ask for a prophet. Send this prophet back to the temp agency. We asked for a deliverer, not a prophet. It would be like if you were stranded on the side of the road and you called AAA for help, but instead of sending a tow truck, they email you a pamphlet on safe driving. It would be something like that. But then again, if you're wrecking over and over again, well, you not only are going to need a bunch of tow trucks, but a pamphlet on safe driving might do you some good as well. Unless you have a wife who's a backseat driver, and I can loan you one if you need one like that. But deliverance obviously hadn't solved all their problems. They'd been delivered before. They'd been delivered more than once. So rather than sending a deliverer first, God sends a prophet first, and the prophet, we have no idea who he is, an unnamed prophet. We don't know anything else about him except for his message from the Lord. The Lord says, I keep working with you, and I keep showing you, and I keep teaching you, but you don't listen to me. Maybe that's why all this keeps happening to them over and over again. I wonder how true that might be for some of us in areas of our lives. We don't listen to what God teaches, to what His Word says, so we wind up in some similar cycle where things keep happening the same way over and over again. We keep getting the same results over and over again. Just like the people of Israel. Different particulars in our lives, of course, but exactly the same pattern. And perhaps for the same reason that the unnamed prophet provides. We don't listen to the Lord. And yet the Lord still has hope and keeps delivering us, just like He did Israel. The text doesn't say how the people responded to this unnamed prophet. They might have stoned him. We don't even know. But immediately we see God calling and identifying the judge who will lead the Israelites in battle against the Midianites. And this is one of the judges that many of you might have heard of. This is a story that's preached upon a lot. The judge's name is Gideon. Some of you have heard of that story. Coincidentally, in a cave in Canaan, they found a picture on the cave wall of Gideon. There it is, a good picture of Gideon. You never know what these guys are going to look like. When I preached my very first sermon on Gideon, I was in a little church in Indiana, and I asked one guy in our congregation if he'd ever heard of Gideon in the Bible. He said, yeah, that's the guy who puts all those Bibles in the hotel rooms. That's Gideon. I said, absolutely, that is the Gideons. And they are named after Gideon or in honor of Gideon. But Gideon was a simple farmer in Israel who at God's request and with God's mighty power, he became a warrior and a leader, overcoming his doubts and fears. But his story did not start out that way at all. Here we go, chapter 6, verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak tree in Ophrah, different Ophrah than the one you know, that belonged to Joash the Abzerite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep the wheat from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, many of the Hebrew people, we just said, they fled to the mountains, they fled to the caves, they're hiding in fear for their lives. Gideon was one of those, and he's hiding in a wine cellar. He's hiding in a wine cellar. Obviously, he's not a good Baptist. He had a wine cellar, correct? Right? If he was a good Baptist, he'd opened a golden corral instead. That would have been different. But Gideon is hiding in a wine cellar, and he's threshing wheat in a wine cellar. Now, you normally wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do anything in a wine cellar except keep wine. You would thresh wheat above ground where the wind could help you blow and separate the wheat and the chaff. But because they were so scared of the Midianites, he was hiding, doing this in the ground because he was afraid like everyone else. And so when an angel of the Lord appears to him, he's afraid, and an angel calls out to him, calls him a mighty warrior. He looks around and says, who are you talking to? You're certainly not talking to me. Is there a Midianite soldier somewhere around? Because he would have thought of himself, he is certainly not a mighty warrior. He's just a farmer who's scared like everyone else. Isn't this interesting? God sees him from the very beginning as a mighty warrior. God sees him differently. So once Gideon realizes that there are no Midianite warriors around and that God is indeed talking to him, he has two good questions for God. Verse 13. Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? God is with us. Why are all these terrible and oppressive things not only has happened to us, but keeps happening to us over and over and over again? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? What miraculous thing, God, have you done for us lately? Don't we all love that question? What have you done for me lately? I know you did something for Grandma and Grandpa, but what have you done for me? Though sending him an angel seems like a pretty good start. But he says, now the Lord has abandoned us, given us into the hand of Midian. And then God gives Gideon a pretty good specific answer, verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, you go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? God says to Gideon, it's your turn. Now, don't worry about Grandma and Grandpa. It's your turn now. I'm going to do these great things to you. And Gideon says, no way. And the angel of the Lord gives him this great answer to everything. Verse 16. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites. I will be with you. God's answer to so many things, isn't it? I will be with you. I'll never leave or forsake you. I'll be with you always to the end of the age. God's answer for so many things. I'll be with you. You may be a small, cowardly man, but I'll be with you. You may doubt that you are called or qualified, but I'll be with you. You may be doubtful that anything can change because you've given up on things changing, but I'll be with you. You may be caught up in this cycle of the same thing happening over and over again, but I'll be with you. In a very real way, God is saying to him, I am the change you're waiting for, even when and if you doubt it. And Gideon doubted it. Look at verse 17. He said, if I found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it's really you talking to me. Okay, give me a sign. Please go away, and I'll come back and bring an offering and set it before you. Please don't go away, and I'll go get an offering and bring it back before you. And will you wait for me? And God said, yes, I'll wait for you. God does that, doesn't he? Sometimes God has to wait for us a long time, but this is pretty typical of God. God said, I'll wait for you. And he went and got a bull and killed the bull, and he's going to bring back this sacrifice, as would have been very common in that day. And God is there, and the angel is there. The angel of the Lord takes the sacrifice. Fire comes down from heaven, and burnt offerings, just like when I try to cook dinner, happens all the time, so I've seen this for real. And then the angel disappears, and Gideon's convinced for a moment that God is talking with him. But even that's not going to last. Because best case scenario, this will still keep happening over and over again because we've seen it happen in the past. It's going to happen again. Worst case scenario for Gideon, he's thinking, I could die in this round. If I'm going to be involved in some sort of battle with the Midianites, I could die in this round. And so Gideon and the entire people of Israel are living in what we would call this shadow of a doubt. That anything will ever change, that they could be a part of changing anything. They're just living in this shadow of a doubt. They don't believe it'll change. They don't believe it'll get better. It might get worse. And Gideon says to himself, no matter what, I can't do anything about it, and I'm not sure that God's going to do anything about it. Have you been there? That thought, you can't do anything about it, keeps happening around and around. You're not sure if God can do anything about it as well. You have some of the same doubts. But God is going to start with Gideon with his doubt, and God's going to build faith on top of and out of that doubt. Same thing he'll do with you. God will start with you right where you are. If you're in the middle of doubt or if you're in fear, God will start right where you are and begin to build faith right on top of that. Gideon shares his doubts, and they're very significant. He said, if the Lord's with us, why has all this happened to us? Maybe the Lord's not still with us. He doubts God's presence. Do you ever do that? Doubting God's presence? They'd been oppressed for 7 years by the Midianites, and he simply asked, if you're with us, why is all this tragedy befalling us? I think so many times, I think we've asked that question in many ways. You know, I've been in pastoral ministry long enough to have been there and heard people ask unanswerable questions about why things happen in the way that they happen. And I've heard seen people push away from God and go, God, I just feel like you're not here. Where are you, God? As the psalmist in Psalm 10, right? You know, God, where have you? Why do you stand far away from me? I've heard people express that they feel that way. And then on the opposite side, in some of the same type of difficult, painful, tragic situations, I've heard people say, I've never felt closer to the Lord than I have in this. Gideon had not gotten to that point yet. He's still doubting God's presence. He doubted God's choice of him as a leader. God, it can't be me. I'm not a mighty warrior. He says this, look at verse 15. He said, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in my tribe, Manasseh, and I'm the very least one in my family. So you should pick someone from another clan, from another tribe, and from another family, and even if all those lined up, I'm not the right guy. but God had chosen him. He needed the confidence to believe that he was God's choice, that he could do something greater than he ever believed that he could. We know later, when you know the rest of the story, and then you read in Hebrews, when the New Testament writer's looking back on it, on how God chose him, it's actually pretty amazing. The writer in Hebrews says, what more can I say? That time is too short. I don't have the time to tell you about Gideon, who by faith conquered kingdoms, who gained strength after being weak, became mighty in battle, put foreign armies to flight. He was remembered as doing all of that. But at this point, he doubted that God was with him. And he doubted that even if God was there, that God would choose him. He doubted the plan. He doubted God's plan. He asked for a sign. Let me know first that this is you. God let him know, okay, I'm here with you. I'm the one talking to you. He got where he believed that. And then you'll find out long about verse 33. The Midianites are planning for an assault on Israel. And the angel of the Lord tells Gideon, I want you to get some troops together and go out and meet them and push back this assault. And Gideon again is saying, oh, God, I'm not sure. Okay, I'm sure it was you talking to me first, but I'm not sure you're ready for this, that you're going to follow through on this plan. Your part in this plan, there's a battle going to take place. Judges chapter 6, beginning with verse 36, this is the great story where Gideon lays out a fleece. So he placed a wool fleece on the threshing floor, and he said, okay, and tomorrow morning, Lord, if there's dew only on the fleece, but the ground is dry, then I'll know you're the one and that you're going to deliver Israel by my hand, just as you said. And sure enough, the next morning it was exactly as he had asked. The ground was dry and the fleece was wet. He wrung out the fleece and a bowl full of water was in it. And then Gideon said this. He said, okay, that was pretty good, God. That was pretty good. Let's reverse it now. Can we do that? Is that all right if we reverse it? Let's let the fleece be dry. We'll put it out. We'll let it be dry and let the ground be wet. You read the end of that down in verse 39, and it says exactly the same. It happened exactly like that. That night God did so. Verse 40. The fleece was dry. The ground was covered with dew. Gideon understood what God wanted him to do. He said, I get the message, but is this message really from you, or did I just make this up and imagine it? So he asked God for these miraculous signs, and folks have been doing that ever since. Maybe you've done that. I think the signs personally are very confusing. Very confusing sometimes. Two preachers on the roadside had this sign, the end is near. The end is near. Turn around before it's too late. The end is near, turn around before it's too late. A driver passed by and yelled at them, leave us alone, you religious fanatics. And then as soon as the driver passed in his car, the preachers heard a large splash as the car went in the river. And one preacher said to the other, do you think our sign should have just said, bridge out ahead? Well, that's the way many of us interpret signs from God, or pretty close to that. I read this story about a woman. She was praying about whether she should take a trip to Hawaii, and she's going to pray before she went to sleep that night, and she prayed, and she woke up the next morning, and she looked on the nightstand. She saw her clock said 7:47. She said, that's the answer to my prayer. I should take a 7:47 to Hawaii. There's one leaving this morning. Interpret it that way. I do something similar. Some mornings, I want a donut at Herb's Bakery. You know Herb's Bakery? But I know a donut's not good for me. I don't really need a donut. So I pray, God, if you want me to have a donut, then let there be a parking space open right on Larkin Avenue in the front, so I don't have to pull in the parking lot. You know what? One day there was one open. I prayed that prayer. There was a parking space open. Only had to drive around the block 12 times to get that parking space open. But that's how that works with those signs. I'll give you one. It's true. I looked this up because I remembered it vaguely. The last time I preached on Gideon was 4 or 5 years ago. And on the Thursday of that week that I was going to preach on Gideon, it was in a series called Overcome. We're talking about overcoming doubt, so some of the same stuff. It was the Thursday of that week, I kid you not, 2 people from the Gideon's organization showed up unannounced here at church on that Thursday. And I told them that. I said, boy, this is really odd that you get. And of course, they said, yeah, that means that you should give us some money. So that's the way that works. But it was amazing to me. I said, hey, you guys should listen to this message because 2 guys from the Gideon showed up unannounced on the week that I was going to preach on Gideon. What does that mean? I don't know if it means anything or not. But maybe what we learned from Gideon is that God meets you where you are. And if you're asking God for a sign, maybe God will meet you right there. Maybe God would give you a sign as he did Gideon. Maybe God would teach you in that moment that you don't need the sign that you think you want. God will meet you where you are. God will meet you in your doubting. God will meet you in your fears. God will meet you with what you need. And he'll take you forward to where you need to be. But Gideon was doubting that. Doubted that God had this plan. God met him where he was and showed him. Last thing on this one, he doubted God's way. He had a battle to fight. He wanted to get a big army together. We'll talk about this next week, so he's going to skip it. He doubted God's way. He wanted to get a lot of soldiers together, and if Gideon got all the soldiers he could get, he'd still be outnumbered 4-1 in this battle against Midian. If he got all the soldiers he wanted to get. He discovered that God's way was for him to be outnumbered more along the lines of 450-1. And Gideon would doubt that that's the right way to approach this battle. Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 55 tells us very clearly, sometimes God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. God's ways are higher. God's thoughts are higher. Sometimes we don't understand those. But notice that in the midst of this, God met Gideon where he was. God met Gideon in the shadows of all his doubts and all his fears, and then God led him to come out of those shadows. God led him out of the shadows. Gideon didn't think it could change. This had been going on for years and years and years. He didn't think it could change. This cycle kept going, and if there was a remote possibility that this could change, Gideon thought, I doubt I'm the guy to lead this. You see, God actually believed in Gideon before Gideon believed in God to bring him this victory. Read this out loud with me. This is my favorite verse in this chapter. I just love this verse. Let's read this together. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. God called Gideon not as Gideon felt that he was, but as God saw that he could be. The late, great Stephen Covey has this quote. He said, treat a man as he is, and he'll remain as he is. Treat a man as he can be and should be, and he will become as he can and should be. That's exactly what God did with Gideon. That's what God will do with you as well. That's what God will do with you. 3 things real quick. We'll wrap it up. God doesn't call the courageous. He makes courageous the called. God doesn't call the courageous. He makes courageous the called. If you're studying with us in a small group, I hope that you are in the video series. He uses the word brave. God doesn't call the brave. He makes brave the call. But I had to alliterate it, so we changed it a little bit to courageous. But you can see that Gideon is exactly who he says he is. He's the least in his clan, the least in his family. He doesn't see himself as a leader in battle. He sees himself as someone filled with doubt, not filled with faith. God called him where he was, and God changed him along the way. That's the same thing God does with you and I. The apostles, Jesus' apostles, he called them exactly where they were. They all said early on that they were full of faith and that they were brave. When Jesus gets arrested, what do they all do? They all flee. They all run away. One of them, Peter, and maybe the rest of them did something like this, but he's the one who got caught, so the story got told. Peter swears up and down he doesn't even know him. They're all scared to death and they run away. Even after Jesus is resurrected, they're all hiding in the upper room with the doors locked from the inside because they're scared. But then they do something amazing. God continues to work with them, and they lead the church in the New Testament. The church expands, and the church moves forward. And by the time of their death, and all but one of them were executed for the cause of Christ, and they went to their death in complete courage and bravery. But God met them where they were, led them forward to where He wanted them to be. He'll do the same thing with you. I say this to you guys all the time. I say, Jesus loves you exactly like you are. Jesus loves you just the way you are. Now listen, you're not perfect the way you are. You're not amazing the way you are. But Jesus loves you just the way you are. But He loves you so much, He won't leave you the way you are. He loves you so much, He wants to take you on that journey to make you more like Him. So that you won't be filled with doubt, you'll be filled with courage. So that you won't be filled with fear, you'll be filled with faith. So that you'll be ready to respond to what He wants you to do. Don't expect to be ready when He calls. Just be willing to obey. Don't expect to be ready when He calls. You won't be ready. Gideon wasn't ready, but he was willing to obey. Think about that and what God would call you to do. Second one, you're the activity of God in your generation. The answer to Gideon's questions, hey God, where have you been? What have you done lately? What have we heard all these stories that our ancestors told about? You did these great things. Where are those great things now? Listen, you are the activity of God in your generation. So if you don't see God doing anything in your generation or in our generation, the problem is us. The problem is not God. You are the activity of God in your generation, in your time. Acts 13:36, great verse about King David. Now, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, which, by the way, is the only generation you can serve God's purpose in, is now. David fell asleep and he was buried with his ancestors. And then this very happy note, and his body decayed. Right? When you've served God's purpose in your generation, you'll go to sleep and you'll join David with your ancestors. But until then, God's power, God's work in this generation is you. Ephesians 3:20, God's power to do immeasurably more than all you could ask or imagine. Where does that power take place? Where does that power find its home? In you. He works in you. You're the activity in your generation. Last thing, before you can defeat the enemies without, you have to defeat the enemies within. This is great. Verse 25 and 26. You should read all this sometime. I just love this story. So he had made that first offering to God. He took a bull from his father's house. He's going to take a second bull. Gideon's father, Joash, is going to go, where are all my bulls going? Who's taking all my bulls? So he does this, and then look at what the angel tells him. Take the second bull, then tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole. So the male and female Canaanite deities, main deities there, to tear those down. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height. So tear it all down, build an altar on top of it, take the wood from the Asherah pole, build it up into kindling, set it on fire, and make another offering of the second bull. Gideon does that. There's a whole story. It makes everybody in the community mad. They're going to come kill Gideon. And Gideon's dad does a great thing. Gideon's dad said, well, look, if Baal is such a strong God, let him fight his own battles. But notice this, God's first assignment for Gideon wasn't actually to go into battle against the Midianites. It was to get rid of the idol in his father's house. The idol worshipped by others in his town. So when Gideon cut it down, it made everybody mad, but it began to teach everybody a lesson. It begins at home. Revival begins at home. Change begins at home. You have to defeat the enemies within before you defeat the enemies without. You say, hey, I don't have any idols. I don't have an altar to Baal. I don't have an Asherah pole. I don't have any other kind of pole. Maybe I got a fishing pole, but I don't have anything else. I don't have any idols. But understand, for Gideon's family, the idols weren't things they had instead of God. They worshiped these things in addition to God because they believed that God wasn't enough. God wasn't enough. They had these other idols to guarantee other things like rain and fertility and protection. And they weren't working very well for the Israelites, but they won't work very well for you either. But we adopt idols in the same way and for the same reasons. When we think God is not enough, we add something else. When we doubt that God can handle everything in our lives because it's too complicated or it's been going on too long, or we doubt that God himself is enough to change it. Truth is, he is. God is enough to change it. But you've got to believe that enough to cut down and lay aside all the other idols that you have. And you may keep those idols at home in your heart, so we don't even know that you have them. We don't know when you turn to them. We don't know that you count on them. And yet those enemies of God within have to fall first, or the enemies without will continue to win over and over again. But God is enough to defeat both of them. Gideon learned that truth. He had nothing else going for him. He was exactly as he described himself. He was a coward. He was full of doubts. He was in the weakest clan in his tribe. He was at the bottom of the pecking order in his family. But he cleaned out the idols at home. He came out of the shadows of his doubts and fears, and he became what God called him from the very beginning, a mighty warrior whom the Lord was with. May that very same thing be said of you and of me.